So I think it's very important because ICSF's work, as well as all of the work that social organizations, the social movements and all do, is not simply about the resource. As you can see with all of the conversations we've been having, it's not limited to just talking about fisheries as a production system and a commodity and a market, but also as the community's rights, the community's cultures, and what are their entitlements and their, the tenure rights, as we also call it. So there's, other than the legal framework that we talked about yesterday, which was the how you govern the ocean space, how you also govern biodiversity and natural resources, living resources. There is also the wider body of work is actually on what we call human rights. Right? So our fundamental rights, the great work from Ambedkar and all the others, was very influenced by things like the notion of civil rights that came from the French Revolution and the American Constitution, but also the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that came after the war, and countries really coming together and talking about a notion of a global, universal, indivisible idea of human rights. So everyone is entitled to it. Everyone has a wide range of rights, so it's not just civil and political rights, which comes in 1966 as a covenant. These terms, let's not get into right now what is a covenant as opposed to a declaration. All these things are more like international law issues. I'm not an expert on it, but also they might not be importantly, immediately relevant right now. But what we're saying is, and also not to forget that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which the US was the champion of, Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of the president, was the champion of, at the same time that the blacks in America or the women in America didn't have the right to vote. So the hypocrisies are immense. The South African government was still carrying out apartheid, and there were a host of countries in the Middle East, in the African continent, Latin America, that was still not independent. But yet what this is important is to connect it to our constitutions, that is the Indian constitution or the others, and to know that there is a recognition of human rights at the international level. So India, for example, is a signatory to all three of these. Many countries, if you see, they will pick one or the other. The US, for example, because they don't believe in labor rights as a concept, they have not ratified economic, social, and cultural rights, whereas places like China, because they are not democracies, they have not ratified civil and political rights. So there's all kinds of variations in how countries recognize these. Now, other than the universal declarations and the covenants which recognize a range of rights, so included in these, like economic, social, and cultural rights, is the right to a adequate standard of living. Right, what we call human development and things like that. So this is something that's also very important for fishing communities, because even if you don't have, let's say, Vijayan was talking yesterday about the notion of indigenous people not being recognized in Indian law, but at the same time, in the universal setting, you still have recognition of the rights of all communities. That includes women. So when you talk about the CEDAW, one of the very respected conventions for the protection of women against all forms of discrimination, we're talking about specifically participatory decision making, adequate living standards, social security. So how is this relevant in the fishing community context? We know, as Nalini was talking about, others were talking about, if you only talk about women in the post-harvest sector, you don't include them in issues of management. So decision making when it comes to fisheries is really in the hands of men. And a lot of the fishing communities don't have it's either a cultural aspect, or they don't have the kind of institutions that encourage women's participation, right? So if you go to the East Coast or many places in the West as well, the coastal communities have what's called the village panchayats, the caste panchayats, but those panchayats are mostly represented by men. And all of the fishing conflicts, gear conflicts, but also thinking about marriages, all of those are decided by the men. But of course, there's much more levels of complexity in it, but these are representative mainly of the male interests. So, and then of course we have to remember that a very important aspect is labor, right? So when one of the things that's missed out in the discussions on fisheries is you only talk about managing the resource, or protecting the species. We totally forget about all of the issues of labor that happen. So we only talk about, for example, when the in Thailand, for example, they hire migrant labor from Cambodia or from Myanmar, and the big news that came in New York Times or BBC when they do a slave labor on board fishing vessels, they make a big deal out of it. But actually, if you look at the large vessels, they're nowhere close to indentured or slave labor, but if you see the working conditions on board, the living conditions on board, many of them are going for 20 days, 10 days, 15 days, and they have no toilets, they have no proper drinking water, they carry them in cans. When they come back to shore, they're again living on the boat. So which means 8 months of the year or 6 months of the year that they work as migrant workers, they have no living quarters, right? They have no contract. So what happens is, in the case of deaths at sea or any kind of accidents, the boat owner, if he's a nice guy, he will reach out to the family, arrange for the funeral, give a compensation of something like a few lakh rupees, or the government, if they're in the mood for just a handout, they will give some kind of an amount. But this is not what we need if we're talking about a fisheries, like what Jones and all were saying and others have been talking about, is we're a traditional community. You maintain traditional norms. Whereas if you're the government and you're saying that we need to modernize our fishery, and we also need to develop in scientific management, we should also demand that you then follow the rules. Like, you want to bring everything from the West, bring some of the good things. Like, so what are when we say rights of factory workers, rights of farmers, so the informal economy in India has no labor protections, right? So the ILO, which is actually the oldest body at the international level, even older than the UN, it's in the 1920s that the International Labour Organization was set up, and they have a host of measures that various conventions that they have that talk about the rights of workers, the rights of there's a convention against child labor, hazardous child labor, there's conventions for protecting factory workers, processing workers, but they also have many maritime conventions. Maritime meaning so all the industries at sea. So they have protections for, let's say, merchant vessels and things like that, which are much more organized sectors. They have hiring and firing and all those policies. So the fisheries had been excluded from that because for the longest time, the fishing industry was not formal in many parts of the world. But now if you see in the West and in many other parts, you have much more formalized systems for fisheries. So what starts to happen is that in the mid-2000s, they come up with, in 2007, they come up with the Working Fishing Convention. It is a dedicated convention at the ILO for protection of the rights of fishing workers. Now, the concept of decent work we can get into later. It's not just the work. We're talking about many other ideas in that. So your right to social security. Social security, you know what that is? Like unemployment allowance, or let's say any other kind of pensions, you know, health schemes, all of these are social security, social protection measures. Your right to having a contract when you're going to work. Yeah. So this is not possible in the case of owner-operator vessels like you have in Trivandrum or you have in the small canoes that you saw here. But when you talk about the larger vessels, like say Veeravalli, Malpe, Bangalore, Visakhapatnam, Chennai, these big boats, the trawlers and the mechanized vessels, it is something that is desirable. It's still going to be very difficult to have these kind of things in place which can protect the rights of fishery workers. Now the thing with the ILO convention, it's not mentioned here, there's one called C-188, sorry, it is mentioned. That what you need to do is, if you're ratifying it, which India has not done, no countries in South Asia have done it. In fact, only about 20 or 24 countries around the world have done it, most of them Europe and North American countries. If you are going to ratify it, then there's a whole host of measures that you need to put in place in order to protect your workers, so which means that you would have need in your marine fishery regulation acts, or in your, if there was a national legislation for fisheries, which India doesn't have, you would need to bring in labor protections for workers. right? And then you'd also need to have inspectors on board these fishing vessels, which means that if they're at a harbour, you'd need dedicated officers to go and look at it. So in India, for example, the Labour Department has no interest in looking at fishery workers, because as per our laws, the Labour Department doesn't look into fisheries. But the MFRAs of many states have certain very small facets of decent work in there, like safety at sea. So all large vessels are supposed to have a life buoy and a life jacket on board. Many, I don't think all MFRAs have it. Some Gujarat, Kerala, some of the others have it. So that is one aspect, one very tiny aspect of it. But you have many other measures, like let's say hours of rest, hours of work. So you can't have an 8-hour work day in fishing that many people might have talked about. So in fisheries, because it's such a constantly dynamic resource, in fact, the fishery world is unique in that the workers are working and the rest of the world is sleeping. He said there's nothing to do with daylight. It's all lunar. So you can't have things like 8-hour work day, 9 to 5 in fisheries. You can't even have it in farming. But in this case, you need some kind of a regulation for rest hours, manning hours means when you're manning your gears and your net and things like that. And certain other things such as checking the health of fishers. I was just having a conversation with you today about how mental health is a new area that we want to also explore. Issues of alcoholism, issues of just depression and many other things that we think about as just being, oh, it's part of the work of fishing, it's such a difficult job. But you need to also, and they have lower life expectancy. If you see the Indian workers, comparatively to farmers, the fishers have lower, the fishers, but not the women, the men who fish, they have lower life expectancy if you see it grossly statistically. And then there's many other measures that we won't go into the detail of. So broadly, and there's many other instruments such as the protection of indigenous people. Yeah, one of the ILO Convention 1989. So that in India, of course, indigenous people, we don't have, as in the scheduled tribe framework, many people working, except if you see in the Bombay boats and the Maharashtra boats, a lot of indigenous people from inland areas come as migrants. They are not traditionally fishermen. In Goa as well. Now, what the ILO Convention for in fishing, work in fishing, does not apply to is the onshore workers. So that's the unfortunate thing. Processing workers, if you're on board a vessel, like you have in the West, or some of the big fishing vessels, like super trawlers now, many of them have processing on board. So if you have ratified the ILO Convention, such as let's say Norway has done it, they would have to make sure that even the processing workers on board the fishing vessels are taken care of. Fishermen anyway are taken care of, fishermen, whoever is on board. So it's on board the fishing vessel, not those who are on the shore. But what it does do, if you ratify this, it will create a precedent for protection of an informal sector, and then you can also start to talk about women. Women do need protection. So in India, for example, women don't have protection even if you're working in one of the larger processing factories for fisheries. It's not even coming under some of the big factory workers' laws. Forget about small markets and things. They don't even have any. But one thing we should also remember is that when we talk about decent work for women, or for any kind of show-based workers, we also need to look at market conditions. So the fish market, as you have seen, I don't know if on your field trip you went to a fish market as well? No, but you must have all in some time in your lives gone to a fish market. So there, like, what are the, like, let's say Dakshin Banga Matsyepi Forum or the Maharashtra women, if you see from the MMKS union, all a part of NFF, the Tamil women, all of them, one thing they have always asked for is, in the market, what are our rights? We need to get, they don't have proper toilets, they don't have proper running water, they have no health facilities. Ideally, they should have a crash, crash for children. None of this is there. So, I mean, childcare is something we can think about later, but even a basic thing like a toilet or medical facility. So this is the last item on the international scene that I'll talk about. So this host of This host of kind of legal measures, protections, rights that we discussed over the years from the 80s to now, or even if you go further back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, these finally culminate through the advocacy of fishing communities, their organizations, the fish work organized social movements, and several other civil society organizations. That process of saying that when we talk about fisheries management, we shouldn't only talk about the resource, but also the fishing community itself and its rights, culminated in a 5 to 6 year process that started in 2008 in a global conference on small-scale fisheries, and a real bottom-up kind of process of consultation with this. The first, if you look at all of the other UN, what we call instruments, they are all created by governments, right? And so civil society participation in that, civil society includes all, right? People's organizations, NGOs. Their participation in it is next to nothing, very little. But this one was one of those unique moments in international law or legal setting that you had over 4,000 or 5,000 people consulted around the world in multiple workshops coming into the FAO, so headquarters in Rome, and finally negotiating this over 2 to 3 years and coming up with the voluntary guidelines for securing sustainable small-scale fisheries. Now you'll notice right at the beginning it's called voluntary, so it's not a binding instrument. Yeah, so that should be kept in mind, but that shouldn't discourage us right away. The reason why this is important is that the 150 plus countries that are represented in the FAO, including India, have a moral obligation. To what extent we can, evoke morality with governments such as the ones we have is a different thing. But in terms of customary law and what we consider as a rules-based human rights respecting international framework, this instrument has got wide recognition. So if you see it, India is one of the few countries that in its draft National Fisheries, Marine Fisheries Policy 2017 actually had named it in the list of things that they are aspiring to implement, including, if you see the previous one, they even talked about the Fishing Convention. They also talked about women's rights. So one thing that we must keep in mind when we look at Indian policy in the next few sessions is that this instrument, for example, if you go into it, it is a culmination of all of the various rights that we've seen slowly being recognized in the world and then being discussed in the fisheries context. So you talk about the rights to resources, as we saw in the first half of our discussion yesterday, which is recognized in international law for fishing communities. Then you come to things like social development, so everything from decent work, labor conditions, working conditions, living conditions. Social development means health, education, social security, women's rights, so everything in the post-harvest sector. So it's not even just talking about fishing, this is talking about every aspect of fisheries. From the time that you make a net to the time that the fish arrives at your plate, all of those, so the trade, the sanitary measures that you put in place for it, all of these what should be kept in mind is not just the science or the regulation to manage the resource, but the rights of the people who are involved in the sector, which, as we saw with the statistics, 90% of fish workers around the world are small-scale fishers. They're traditional fishing communities that have evolved through a real organic process. Their practices have come through that with lots of complexities and variations across the world. So I won't go into specificities of these guidelines, we'll just take all day. So what we want to look at when we talk about fisheries in India, the policies that we're going to discuss is that on one hand, if the government is saying that we will adopt a precautionary approach, we will look at an ecosystem approach to fisheries management. Does anyone know what an ecosystem approach to fisheries management is? I know it sounds very technical, and it is a little technical, but it's quite obvious. Because for years, what fisheries managers, the scientists and all that Jones talked about, only thought about in fishing was the targeted species. Right? That itself is a Western idea. When an Indian fisherman or woman goes to sea or fishes with a fishing net in the tropical waters, you're not really catching a single species. you're getting a host of species. Of course, with shoaling fish like sardine or mackerel and things, you're going mainly for that. But otherwise, if you're going with a demersal net, you're catching a host of croakers and pomfret and all the great fish that we like. So an ecosystem approach to fisheries management evolved through those international processes that we discussed yesterday. What it means is that you are looking at the ecosystem as a whole, right? So when you're looking at the ecosystem as a whole, you don't then just push for deep sea fishing with large trawlers. You don't, for example, go and plunder your EEZ with oil and natural gas or anything like that you want to pull out, because you can't talk about ecosystem management and environmental impact assessments on one hand and then do this kind of complete rule breaking on the other. So this is the normative. We're just talking about the normative. The reality of the situation, Jones has already discussed. We will go into with the policies. But one thing that should be kept in mind when we talk about the blue economy, when we talk about fisheries management or the various policies, is that the blue economy, for example, where did the idea come from? The World Bank, of course, is now the one that's pushing it, and Vijayan and Anil and all will go into it. But the blue economy as a terminology came in the, again, 2012. We were talking about the Rio Declaration in 1992. 20 years after that, they had a meeting called the Rio Plus 20. It's in this meeting that they came up with the idea of the green economy. Now, we all know the word greenwashing when a corporate puts out an ad saying that this is a green sector, or what is the word they use now in all the corporate literature? Something with the green. Greenscaping could be one of them, yeah. So the green economy, though, as a concept, what it was trying to move away from, because of the pressure of the environmental groups and many civil society groups as well, that were mainly like the indigenous people who were dependent on their forests, or the fishing community people around the world who wanted to maintain the integrity of their coast. They were trying to talk about an economy that would move away from the old polluting mining, oil and other resource extractive industries and move to a greener economy. So this notion of sustainable consumption and production, which itself has its problems. Niti was talking about it on the first day. You can't continue to talk about consumption even if it's sustainable. There is no such thing as ever increasing ideas of consumption. But these were ideas that were discussed in the context of the green economy, and then in 2012, many of the coastal states and the small island states such as in the Pacific, Samoa, Micronesia, all of these countries in the Caribbean as well, said that what green economy opportunities do we have? We have these tiny islands and we have these gigantic exclusive economic zones. So we need an idea of the blue economy. And what that meant for them, specifically the small island states, is that if you have, let's say, multiple lakh or million square kilometers of the EEZ and only a tiny bit of land, which means that for all of the things that you're dependent on in a modern economy, such as oil, such as drinking water. So if you go to places like Samoa, others, they don't even have drinking water. They bring it in cans, like we drink in Chennai, out of cans. But all of the oil is imported. So what they were trying to push for was that not for oil-intensive sectors. Some countries also wanted to explore oil in the thing, but they were saying that, for example, we have this precious tuna resource in our EEZ, and we already have fisheries agreements with many countries. And these countries can sign these agreements, take the fishery resource and pay what is the access fee. These run into, so if you see this Pacific fisheries agreement with Europe and other countries that fish in their waters, it goes into like $400 million and stuff like that. And that is, it's almost like imagining India's GDP being fully supported by one particular sector. So I think we need to have a discussion of where fisheries, as we now know through the many discussions that we've had, is a very, very complex sector. It is not like one farm law or something can govern it, or even 3 farm laws. These are the various laws that we know of that govern. Even now, India doesn't have an exclusive economic zone fisheries regulation. So which means that all of the fishing that's happening on this side is just a kind of informal, unregulated fishing. So as per international law, a lot of this stuff that happens here is not even something that you can recognize. You have many guidelines. You have, for example, some of the larger ships, larger fishing vessels can be registered under the Merchant Shipping Act, which makes the Marine Merchant Shipping Department, MMD department, the nodal agency for looking at that. But they have no mandate to govern fisheries. It's like talking about disasters. If a disaster happens at sea, the fisheries department is not able to play any role in saving the fishing communities. It is the Coast Guard that you have to depend on. Sometimes the Coast Guard will say, I can't even go that side, the Navy has to do. That's what happened with some of the cyclones like Oki. So this is the complex kind of picture that emerges of when you look at all of those international instruments, when you talk about all of those issues that are affecting fishing communities, you need to see where it is that we can place these, to create a matrix of which department can handle which particular, what role it can play. It's either a welfare role or it's a regulatory role. So I think that some people wanted a discussion of, for example, the Wildlife Protection Act. Right? So the Wildlife Protection Act, actually, if you read it, it's the last resource for us, the last recourse for a species. Right? So it is the protection of the species when nothing else is working, which is why you create a protected area or you put them on the CITES red list species, such as India has several species of sharks and turtles and things that are protected. Now that shouldn't be something that we use usually for fisheries management. Yeah, so fisheries management should play the role of governing the fisheries in a way, in a participatory way with the fishing communities, so that only at the end do you have to resort to something like the Wildlife Protection Act, which means that we cannot continue with our same idea of just endlessly funding subsidized trawlers and not putting an end to mechanized fishing and come up with protections for the small-scale fisheries sector, but also regulate the small-scale fisheries sector. Because as much as I agree with the perspective that these are traditional communities, if we are talking about an ethic of sharing, we cannot say that the fishing community, like anyone else, is perfect. Otherwise, you wouldn't see things like the ring seine or the use of lights to fish in parts of Kerala, or even more destructive methods that are being used. Yes, it is a coping mechanism of a community that is desperate because it has been pushed there by economic forces that have created the kind of inequities of the mechanized versus motorized. But you still need regulations in place that can go back to that notion that we're trying to protect, which is that it's a traditional community guarding it as a steward, right? Our notion of stewardship, that we are taking care of this resource together, so the co-management, all of these things. So the draft National Fisheries Policy, for all its flaws, which we will discuss tomorrow, has all of these aspirational terms, right? It talks about women's welfare, it talks about women's gender equity, it talks about ecosystem management, it talks about trying to come up with total allowable catch. So these are all like very aspirational, very good things to listen to. But then on the other hand, they have things like we're going to push for deep sea fishing vessels, which will take millions of dollars. It's going to create another form of inequity where they will, because like we discussed yesterday, there are no sufficient tuna resources or deep sea resources in the sea to sustain something that requires this kind of capital investment. So what happens, as happened in India, is what we call a trawler is not one type of fishing vessel. In that fishing vessel, they might carry 20 types of trawl gear, but also they will carry gill nets. So the longliners, for example, that are the hook-in-line nets, they will also be carrying gill nets. The purse seiners and trawlers actually have to keep separate because that is a completely different rigging mechanism of the boat. So that is very difficult to mix. But this is the complexity of the sector, that you need to also consider that fishing communities are using all kinds of means now to capture the most amount of resources, because it's become that kind of zero-sum game. So that's something that we want to highlight. And just finally, I'll just leave it with this before we go into the discussion, history of course, but after that the policies. Broadly, this is the institutional framework which corresponds with fisheries and fishing communities in India. So I don't expect you to read all of this right now. So if you talk about, this is taken from one of these ministry reports on optimum fleet size management in 2018. So they try to kind of map what is the item that they want to cover and what is the nodal agency. So now you'll see the sheer complexity of it. Deep sea fishing, they don't mean deep sea in the new context of deep sea fishing vessels. They just mean anything in the exclusive economic zone, which is beyond 100 or 200 meters. Yeah. Survey and assessment of fishery resources, research, training. You see that this in there, because it was a 2018 report, they reviewed as Ministry of Agriculture. Now, as we discussed yesterday, there's a Ministry of Fisheries, Animal Husbandry, Dairy, inside that Department of Fisheries. So the Department of Fisheries will look at the central government ministry will look at deep sea fishing. Whereas if you were to come to some of the fishing vessels in list 2, you will see that the state governments are empowered to look at a lot of things. When you talk about marine pollution by ships, protection of endangered species, if you see the Coast Guard Act, for some reason the Coast Guard has some responsibilities to look into wildlife protection. What training do they have to look at wildlife protection? Like Jones said, many of them are North Indian officers who don't even know the sea, so they're falling sick half the time, so they don't even know fishery, let alone the biology or the protection of the species. When we talk about seafood exports, quality control, we're talking about the MPDA, right? The Marine Products Export Development Authority, which comes under the Commerce Ministry, because it's export oriented, which is why when you talk about fisheries subsidies also, it is the Commerce Ministry officials that go to WTO to go and negotiate. When you talk about ports, there is you remember the previous map, there was the Major Ports Act and Minor Ports as well. So these come under different regulations, different authorities as well. When we talk about Wildlife Protection Act, it is the Ministry of Environment Reforms. Yeah. When we talk about infrastructure, such as you see with a lot of the old blue revolution schemes and things like that, it comes under NABARD or now NFDB, which is an agency, semi-autonomous agency under the ministry. So you see this various kind of, and one conspicuous thing that's missing here is the social aspect. Because what is assumed is that the fisheries department actually, if you go to any of the state fisheries departments and ask them what is your job, they'll say that we are actually here for the welfare of the fishermen, which means that they want to hand out their leasing subsidies, they want to hand out their boat registration licenses or other schemes. So it's just for the schemes and other things which are very important, but the fisheries department just does not have the capacity. Capacity means many things, so functions, functionaries and the resources to handle the job of management, which includes everything, as we saw, not just the resource, but the labor aspects of it, the social welfare aspects of it. So these various sectors govern all of the things that we're thinking. So in this, you'll also see the Ministry of Earth Sciences coming. Like we were talking about the INCOIS alerts. The INCOIS has one positive role as well, like the IMD, which is that if you didn't have the INCOIS, you wouldn't be getting some of the weather alerts and the tsunami alerts. Yeah. It's half the time not effective, but that's it. So this is the broad governance framework. So what we've not covered here is who looks at labor, who looks at decent work, who looks at the markets, women's issues, health, all of this. So that we need to kind of map. That's the job that many civil society organizations and organizations like NFF should also do when we engage with policy. You have all of these things. We will take care of the welfare of the fishing community. We will take care of women's needs. So we need to see how it is that we can also push. Because you're going to have various levels of governance, right? You will have some that are either criminal governments that are not really interested at all in the welfare, or you'll have in some cases some more benevolent or sympathetic governments such as the Kerala government or the governments that you see in some other states, which will play a much more positive role in the welfare of fishing community. So there, how do we make sure that the fishing community or the fisheries department can be pushed through advocacy, through our work to also look into some of those other aspects that we discussed, which is how we talk about health, how we talk about education in fishing communities. So these kind of issues also need to be addressed. And I'm hoping that we can also have a discussion on that later when we discuss the policy. And one thing that you'll again notice conspicuously missing here is how do we protect the rights of the fishing community to the resource. Now we have all of these laws, but as has been pointed out, when it comes to a port project or Bombay High, the oil drilling, which has been the Bombay fish workers' problem for decades now, when they have any kind of a survey or an exploration for oil, they just shut down fishing and they give some paltry small amount of compensation. Right? So how are we going to, within this legal framework, use various institutions within India, such as the Fisheries Department, the Environment Ministry, the NGT, the ports, all of these institutions to enforce these rules. So some of this would have to take a campaigning approach, some of this would have to take the help of young people like you and others, lawyers, so there are many great lawyers and civil society activists who have been helping the fisheries activists with court cases, with the CZMP mapping, with a lot of other issues. Saravanan will come and talk about how they have been doing it in Chennai and other coastal regions. So a variety of approaches would have to be taken. One thing that we would urge fishing communities as well as civil society to do is to engage with these policies. There are definitely all kinds of forces behind these policies that might be against the interests of fishing communities, but we need to take the best from these international instruments, from the Indian Constitution, from the Indian fisheries draft policy itself. There's all kinds of wording in that is trying to protect fishing community and say that, yeah, on this point we can engage, but on some of the other points we're not going. We're not going to support that. So that is the process of really reading these policy documents, engaging with it. How are you going to lobby? Who are you going to write to? Which department are you going to take this up with? Which hopefully we'll get into the next stage of the discussions. So that's kind of, I'll leave it there because otherwise we'll just keep going on with the discussion. So we will pick up questions later when we get to it.
That list 1, list 2 you have mentioned.
Yeah.
Previous slide.
Sorry, that is actually referring to.
List 1 fishing vessel, list 2.
Yeah, you know what this is? List 1 is in the union list, state list, concurrent list of the constitution. So if you see, as we saw, the EZ fishery is union, central department of fisheries. The list 2 is state list. List 3 is concurrent list. So this is something we need to keep in mind when we talk about cooperative federalism and all. As per the federal nature of India's constitution, the states have the right to govern fisheries in the territories, 12 nautical. Which is why when you see those Marine and Fishing Regulation Acts, all of those protections are only actually for the near shore, 12 nautical miles. And we still don't have a law to govern the, what's called the deep sea fishing. What they mean, because this is an old terminology, Jones, that came in. We're not referring to the same deep sea as the longliners. This is a terminology that came because in India they would talk about the 100-meter depth ISO. That would be the definition. After that is called the deep seas. That came up years ago. So that's what this is referring. It was trying to look at, because these are also important things to keep in mind. So when we talk about exports, you are talking with the central government and
list 1 is the state, list 2 is the state.
List 2 is state, list 3 is concurrent.
Concurrent.
Yeah, so for example, all of the Wildlife Protection Act comes through the central government and state government. So state government, if they want to list any species, if they want to declare a marine protected area, they have to notify it and the state has to pass it. So it's both ways that it works. So that we can, if people want a list of issues that come under these concurrent list, union list and state list, we can provide that.
I have a question. There is so much effort that is being put by a lot of researchers, different folks, in just building this instrument, right? And so many institutions itself, like who have been globally and nationally putting all of this effort. But when it comes to implementation or enforcement and regulation, there's not much work happening there. So if we keep making or building new instruments than looking at the old ones and going about further with them itself, wouldn't it be a waste of resources there? So aren't we supposed to focus more and more on at least trying to implement, enforce, and because something that I work very closely is with CITES and CITES.
Just tell people what CITES is for. CITES.
CITES.
Another convention.
So it's called as Convention on International Trade on Endangered Species. So what happens, you have so much data that has been happening. Though you are a signatory body from India and you keep telling about these particular endangered species and the trade of these endangered species with the neighboring states. For example, because I work with sharks and rays or manta rays, for example. And within India, it is fine to fish. You eat them, you do whatever about it. Okay. Once it passes to or gets out of your water bodies or your boundary, it becomes illegal. So these are some of the aspects that we could actually comes under IUU as well. It's not just about illegality. It's not about not going again further than EEZ zone. But are these aspects actually discussed with the fisher folks or fish workers? We never do that.
Okay, so any more questions? We'll take that up as well. Can she ask?
Okay.
Johnson was talking about how even in the data that we collect and the laws that we form around fisher people, it's just a lot of it doesn't reflect on-ground reality. And what you said is that is true, but this is the framework that we have now, and this is all we can work with at the moment. So even when you talk about campaigning and building a campaign within this legal framework, as an ex-campaigner, I know how hard it is to win a campaign. So even if you do cross obstacles and win the campaign, it reflects only as half a victory for the fisher people on the ground. There's just, you overcame this obstacle, but the very data collection itself has a lot of problems. So can you really count it as a victory for anyone on the ground, and how do you think it?
Okay, can we take up those three and then we can, I think all of them are partly related. What is the benefit to the fishing community on the ground from all of these things that exist on paper is what he asked. Yours also is a similar question. Yours is more of a different management side question. See, on the, I think one must always keep in mind with social change of any kind, but also the creation of these more aspirational norms that we're moving towards, that these are long processes. So it starts with legislation. It's absolutely right that in India we have replaced actual governance with just the act of legislating. So we come up with one thing after the other and then nothing is enforced. That's a good point. But one also needs to talk about when you're saying enforcement. In the notion of governance, what are the things that exist? It's institutions, mechanisms, and functionaries. Right? So you have some institutions in place, but those institutions, as we know, are not strengthened. Those institutions are not participatory. So as we talked about the fisheries department or the scientists, they're going about with their various research, as we talked about mariculture the other day. Who's going to be able to afford it? When you put a cage in the ocean, do we even know that the Indian East Coast is so rough that the cages with one cyclone or tsunami, what's going to happen to that multiple lakh investment? The scientists don't actually, because the research can go. But that's not all the research they do. They also know that the CMFRA and others have contributed many good things as well. Increasingly, it's on the decline of what we do as well. But when you talk about a campaign, I know that we also live in a time with this climate change movement, Greta Thunberg and others who are inspiring to me as well. But what should be remembered is that this, when Nancy Pelosi in America talks to Greta Thunberg, you shouldn't just see it as the politician's cynicism. Because if you're really calling for an end to climate emission, carbon emissions, what are the vast numbers of communities that are going to be affected needs to be kept in mind. Don't think about the robber baron coal miners. Think about the coal mining families and the workers. Think about when you're talking about environmental or climate justice. What is it the vast interest of India, China and other countries that are still the so-called developing countries in trying to ensure a standard of living for its people that should be in some ways equal, but it's not. It's with all the complexity. So when we can't talk about these things with the spirit of urgency. I know that the climate change and the biodiversity discussions right now talk like the world is on the verge of collapse. Some days it feels like that to me. But fishing communities are going to continue no matter what the hell the blue economy and other things go on. They're going to suffer, they're going to fight, but then they have nowhere to go, so they have to keep fighting. So this kind of, I actually don't have a magic wand answer for this, but when we talk about governance, we have to work in the various ways. So the very important aspect of good governance that societies like in India we forget about is civil society. Fishing communities, farmers, forest people, what are the roles that they can play in not just setting the norms but also making sure that they work together with government. So we don't always have it. Forest Rights Act, for example, was one of those landmark bills and acts that try and put that in place. But as you see, unless there is a really good Action Aid or other NGOs that are in Kalpa Vriksha who is involved in the forest rights, setting the community rights claims, you won't have it because they are the ones who have the power to go and talk to a forest official and shout at him. Work towards changing our institutions to be geared towards that. It's not this Mai Baap Sarkar as we call it, that they're just there for our, we are sitting and looking up to them for handouts or whatever. That's why we talk about a rights-based discourse. So you can't call many of these things schemes, there are rights. So when you talk about Narega, they always call it a scheme. No, it's a right. The right to food in the PDS system is a right, it's not a scheme. So if the government is denying us that, like the greats who are fighting for, whether it is the Jean Brez or the smaller names that we don't even hear of, who are going and doing social audits, going to the courts to enforce that the PDS delivery is on time or the Narega is being enforced. This is the job that governments need to do, which civil society unfortunately is doing. So a friend of mine, M. Rajshekhar, a great journalist actually, just wrote a book called Despite the State. That Despite the State, if you look at, it talks about this idea of a lot of things exist on paper, but increasingly with the privatization and with the globalized economy, governments are increasingly becoming, almost even if they had good intentions, they're not able to do anything. Because they're rendered powerless by the forces of the economy. But at the same time, we need to still hold on to many of these protections that exist and use them in the courts of law. And how is it that when the Forest Department recently, through the Wildlife Conservation Society's case, they decided to evict over 1 million forest dwellers, right, in 2006?
No.
Oh, that recent?
Yeah.
How is it that that case went to the Supreme Court and immediately that was dropped? So you need that kind of also, I think the fishing communities and the coastal communities need that kind of network of people. So we need to do more to sensitize also the Delhi civil society guys to pick up these issues.
Can I add that? So like you mentioned,
Follow-ups will take up later. I also need to answer some of these questions. One second. On the question of CITs, see the thing is, as I was saying with the Ministry of Environment and Forests, if you see, if the sharks and rays and the turtles are concerned, what they've come up with is the Forest Department, when you don't have capacity for governance, you usually come up with these very sweeping rules like what is done in Odisha. Odisha, the full ban. 7 months of the year, the fishing communities cannot go to sea to fish. The only kind of craft that's allowed, as you know with the turtle nesting sites, is the smallest, the subsistence fishery without even a motor. There are thousands of fishermen there whose livelihoods have been destroyed. The total that they get for 7 months of not fishing is 7,500 rupees, which now I think they're trying to raise to 10,000. But now there's actually a good discussion which is welcome to do away with the ban entirely and to talk about what is the type of gear that you will allow in a very sustainable way and manage the fishery. Because you also should see that the turtles, for example, the olive ridleys are an extremely gregarious species, right? They're nesting and they're reproducing in the millions every season. So actually there is no decline in the population of the... So what you need is a mixed approach where if you see that there is any change in the resource, so you need constant monitoring. This is where good scientists would be able to help the fishermen. You need monitoring, and in that case what you do is if there is any point that you see that there is a sudden change in the olive ridley population, you would come up with a measure to do a temporary ban, which is what they're doing in places like East Africa, protecting some other species like octopus fishery. They'll have seasonal bans which actually go on for months. It's not just our India's 45-day or 57-day ban on fishing, which is also like, these bans were set up in the 80s. We need to come up with new, constantly evolving, because the fishery is constantly evolving, the world is constantly changing, the markets are constantly changing, our production is constantly increasing. Why is it that the fisheries department is only talking about we're going to increase production of aquaculture? Right now what is our production? 7 million tons. They want to produce 25 million tons of fish from culture, which means that you're looking at in the 10 years a 200% rise in production. That is bloody insane. So why is it that the fisheries department is talking about development of fisheries, which basically means increase in production, whereas you have the environment ministry whose mandate alone is to protect at any cost, which is why you see the huge human rights violations of tribal people. 80% of the world's biodiversity coincides with tribal territories. Why is it that the great forests of central India are still the best forests in India? Because the tribal communities are there to protect. So the fish, the same way, while you see in the reports of the 1890s, the British reports say that there were some fishermen in Kerala and Trivandrum and Kanyakumari using dynamite and stuff like that. But still it was small cases of that happening. But the moment you don't manage your fishery and you try and constantly develop it with larger and larger vessels, larger and larger investment, capital intensity, you're going to lead to a situation where you need an environment and forest to do it. But you know, the Ministry of Environment, like you rightly pointed out, can only list the species, but they have no mechanism for its enforcement. So there is, I'm not sure, do you know this? In the fishing harbours, is there a ministry guy or a department guy standing there and looking at what the catch is? No, because they don't have a mandate to do that.
They have a mandate.
Huh?
They have a mandate.
So
I
there's
think
that's a very different ballgame.
No, see, it's the Fisheries Department, the Marine Fishery Regulation Act, which has the many acts of many states have the WLP species that are protected. So they say in the act and the rules that you can't catch certain species and those will be constantly changed. So which means it's the fisheries guy who's supposed to go there and start. But the fisheries guy is not trained to do this. You see what I'm saying? That you need to, when you talk about governance, fisheries people need to be trained and told about what it means. It's
But
one
it's
thing.
it's the forest guard who comes in.
Forest
Yes,
guard
the
will
forest
come.
guard
Catch a
will
shark.
come.
Yeah.
Within a second, the forest guard will be there. People there will
But
get spice.
that's what is
It's a different arena. Because they will come immediately
Why
to the
should
spot.
a forest guard come look at, regulate or,
1 second, please.
why should why should forest department come and look at, what's happening in marine system?
Who do you suggest should look at?
Of course, there should be a whole new system like how we are also proposing about Ministry of Fisheries. There should be people from fishing communities who are trained to do this,
Yeah.
right? Because they know much more about it in better sense,
Yeah.
as compared to somebody who's lived all their life in the forest. And they are the ones who become forest guards.
You know, when you asked this question yesterday to Nalini, she also said something. Who are the people who are contributing to this kind of excessive catch of fish, but also the illegal catch of the protected species. It is mainly the industrial fleet. And I'm not saying the small scale is in any way innocent, because just I was in Andhra Pradesh in February and we were talking to these amazing longline fishermen. Sorry, I'll just clarify this. If you hear their stories from the 80s, they would put these long lines into the water. You know what they were targeting? Sharks. So in the thousands they would be getting sharks. They didn't have very big vessels. It would be from here to there, undecked, motorized vessels. Not very deep. And the stories he was saying that they would bring home, if they accidentally caught a turtle, they would come, they'd eat its flesh, and what they'll do is they'll powder the shell and turn it into all kinds of things. They'll turn it into ornaments. And there are cases where the sharks, for example, were being in the line, were being caught by the dolphins, so then they would harpoon the dolphin. It's like, for an environmentalist, it's a nightmare, basically, the stories. But that is entirely stopped. So if you really notice on the ground, without the presence of any big official or anything, many fish workers are totally aware that sharks are not supposed to be caught, the rays are not supposed to be caught. So how does this come? It's a slow process. If you have...
So here I would like to add a very important thing. Especially when there is a management like this, there's also something called as criminalization, where you show fishermen to be a criminals. You know, this is something that I have been recording very much because of the way how, forest departments look at these species when they're landed. They try to remove the very identifying imprints of the fishes just so that they're not caught. And also one of the biggest things that I see, because I am there on the fish landing site like most of the times in a year, most of the days in a year, so I see that when there is a person from a forest department or a police, whole behavior is very different, and when there's nobody there, it's a very different. And also to take a picture, because as I'm a scientist, I need to record photographs of these animals. So they don't let the people around to take. Now that there is a built of trust, they let me do it. So why is that? Why should we make this a criminal game?
You might want to ask that to organizations like WWF.
Definitely. I'm definitely would be happy to do it. Because that's not something which is...
I think one response to that is...
No, I don't like to say it cynically. I didn't mean to just give a snarky comment. I'll just explain that.
Because I think you should just explain a bit more. So the latest decision of WWF, especially, this is one of the issues in Forest Rights Act. Exactly.
This is the entire state-people conflict.
Exactly.
We talk about the environmental and fishery thing. I think these are
One more addition to what you said. One is criminalization. So they don't. Actually, you are not able to get the exact facts. You won't get. I'm saying for the matter, you won't get. Another thing is related to income tax. Once if the fisher officer or somebody comes there and takes, and if they really give the true fact, so much is getting destroyed and perished because of their short life. But nothing is calculated, and only the catch will be calculated, and that will be valued, and that will be shown in the records. So CMFRI won't get good records. I'm saying now. So none of the government departments and the institute will not get records unless all these issues are sorted out. So that is the main issue of the post.
There are many cases of criminalization. As you said that Ministry of Forest, now it is being governed, but Ministry of Forest has a right to lease out all the mangroves for revenue to anybody. It gives a lease out. We have that rights to lease. That is one point. Other thing is that access. You say this, everything has been accessed. Say Gulf of Mannar. I will have a project, Gamba, which have few crores, and I will surround the entire islands. And I will say that you should not go. Access is completely free. Access and criminal. When the criminalization comes, the other part, which we said in the Ministry of Environment also, that if a person kills elephant, the person kills a tiger, the same charge for a person who kills a cucumber, sea cucumber. So there is the idea is totally different of the marine life and other things. So whatever you said that endangered, that's what I am saying. It was an economy in some years ago. How does it becomes endangered? Then the entire scenario Fisher stops when the fish comes to shore. No, that's all. Fisherman role is over. Then everything is export is done by the other communities. No exporter is charged for this irrigation. He didn't export.
Yes.
No companies has been charged. So the role of fisher gets over when he catches the fish and it comes to the shore. So these aspects, then the same Ministry of Environment comes with the reports. The recent reports are very clear reports. Says that we need natural capital is wetlands. What is their view on conservation? Rather than educating the fisheries department. Fisheries department is nothing to do with fisheries as well as with the welfare. They know only the welfare concepts. Take a fisheries department, because you can't blame a fisheries department as such. Because when you talk about fisheries department, it is just a 12 nautical mile. 0 to 12 nautical mile. Where this system starts. But the entire boats now register under list 1 as you said, under central government. So what power really he has? The power he really has, what enforcement really he has. Now there is a marine police, there is a coast guard. So the power and delusions. Then the same Ministry of Environment in the climate change arena, they said that yes, now there are new concept is coming up, marine conservation areas, which can harness the potential of blue economy inside the conservation areas. Then the so-called ecotourism. Tourists can do anything in Gulf of Mannar, but a fisher can't do anything in Gulf of Mannar. So these are the certain laws, as he said. These are all good in papers. How the reality happens? All the entire departments will be blamed on fishers. Say example of certain things. Say take an example of Oki also. You didn't register the boat for the past 3 years. Then when the Oki happens, you said that all are unregistered boats. We don't know where they went, how these boats has come. A fisher minister or a minister from like defense minister will come, because it comes under external affairs. When Nirmala Sitharaman came to the scene Oki, and he said that we don't know that these fishermen have inside. But they are the Tuttur fishers are doing long time.
Last 2 years,
So you didn't register anything and you blame them as the illegal fishers. The illegal unreported fishers now. See this data yesterday this was saying. Say example, as I said that I have a clear example of that, how they calculate data. My experience, I said, no, my father-in-law was in the same 148 fishing vessel in those days. So they said that how to calculate. Now I asked that how these data are coming out. He said that we will have a logbook. First day we will write 1 ton. Entire there will be, they will have a calculation of the entire 45 days. First of all, we have to show only 1 ton. Then they will put in the sheet like 1, 0, goes from the down. It is like a calculation which my mother does now. Put the entire expenses down and he goes up with the calculation. How does it match? Same when these government officials, when they take the data for like forum like FIO and other things, data sheet will come. They will call each secretary, Baba, how much we put yesterday, last year? Put 2% more, 3% more. Calculate it. So which data you refer? Entire laws, everything talks about fish and fisheries. Fisheries is a resource. That's the fisher likes. It's a jam between here and there. Bread and butter.
I really wanted to add one point. It's more like a question. Considering how having a Ministry of Environment and Forests is actually working to a disadvantage when it comes to forest conservation or anything pretty much to do with forests. What you're seeing today is Prakash Javadekar having, despite, forget about the conflict of interest between, having two contradictory ministries. But what he's essentially doing and what even before in Jairam Ramesh did was act as a stamping authority. So are you not worried that the same thing will happen if you have... Exactly. So are you not worried that the same thing will happen if you have a ministry of, fisheries? Will the same thing not happen? And second question was what Vaishnavi was talking about. We need to go beyond that. Why? Because, okay, you're talking about governance and, all of these things, fine. But what is happening right now on ground, I'll tell you. You go, you agitate and everything, nothing happens. you go to the court, okay, as a last resort, you go to the court agrees with you. This is the case of coastal road in Mumbai. The court agreed with us. The High Court said that the entire thing is illegal. The 2019 amendment to the CRZ, it said that you cannot do that. The government does not have the right to amend the CRZ policy that way, just so that it can add a project as an exception. What happened? What happened? Despite the court agreeing with us, what happened? So that is my entire thing, that we need to go beyond that.
No, I think all this question, Radhika's question will be dealt in the next session in the spark that question, Vaishnavi.
No, but just, I think we can take a break and I can probably have a conversation with Radhika.
Yeah, sure.
Keep talking, because I think they need to go as per the schedule. I won't make up the whole session.
Any final word?
I have a final word.
Right. Okay,
So only reason why I had to bring up this particular situation was only because, looking from a psychology or behavioral perspective, there is this very negative motion. Because, when there were, people who have worked previously as conservationists or scientists, and the way how they treat today's generation of conservationists or scientists who are, more towards being more kind, more towards wanting to learn and work with peace than understanding their mental state, and not about fear in protecting these spaces, but to do it as a collaborative work to create best of possible sustainable options. And that becomes a lot more difficulty if ministries or agencies or institutions do not work and they still have that or carry on such a perspective for a long time.
No, very good points. I think, these are all very kind of loaded, complex things to which no one can actually give you one answer. We need to keep working. It's just that, why is it that Vijayan and others start with a song? Why is it that Medha Patkar even today is sitting in hunger strikes and others? Narmada Bachao Andolan hasn't won anything. But they are some of the most inspiring forces that we have today to continue this. And one thing that we need to kind of keep in mind is that if these laws exist, we still have a good starting point. We have a good starting point in the fact that we have an amazing fish worker organization, we have amazing farmer protests, we have some of the greatest histories of social movements, like environmentalism in the US started in the 20s and 30s with completely pristine ideas of nature, whereas you have what's called the Chipko movement in the mid-70s or 60s that begin the environmental movement as we know it. That's actually not the beginning. The indigenous people started to fight the British in the 1800s itself, or even before that, right? So the notion of people living in nature and what we call ecosystem communities, this new terminology that is coming, is actually people who have a close link to nature. And what Niti was also saying, that everything is linked. So in that sense, this negative view that you talked about will only change with this kind of understanding that fishing communities, farmers, all of these, and us city people who just consume endlessly, have no connection to sources of production, factors of production. What we talk about labor, all of that. It's not just. I feel like there's a excessive focus on environment with the end of the Berlin Wall falling and the communists kind of going down and declining. Why is it that we don't talk about labor and trade unions and people's organizations? So as you said rightly, people need to work together. And the fishing community, one of the hardest things with the fishing community is that the fishermen rarely have the time to organize, right? As you see, their work is so intensive. Their hours are completely different. They're working when people are sleeping. They're sleeping when the rest of the world is, the so-called 9-to-5ers are working. So it's very difficult to actually do social organization the way you can do with even farmers. It's difficult. Trade union at the factory level, actually, industrial level workers is a lot easier. That's why you have the history of the trade union movement. So the struggle of organizing fish workers and things is what we will kind of go into in the next round. Devashish has a lot, I think will be the best example here, Jason talking about it. That history of the struggle of fish workers he's talking about, and as you all know, you met Olencio, he's the new General Secretary of the National Historical Forum, and he's going to need all of our help. All of these organizations that we talked about are going to need the support of the youth and other communities. You're going to have to form alliances and take on these forces. And as we will see with the blue economy or others, it's not one government doing it. So the forest clearances didn't start with Javadekar, they came much before. So these things need to be talked about. So Vijay was talking last night to us about, we are always in the opposition, there's no other part.
Yeah, we just need to be creative more, because we come with different tools. When we have tools, why not make it more creative and be useful?
No, I think see, if you see, the 80s and 90s had a huge environmental push in the fisheries world, because of which a lot of enmity between these groups are. But if you see Greenpeace actually has a very better relationship with fish workers in the south. They are the same guys who fought the Japanese whalers and stuff for good reason. Bloody whaling should be banned. But these are things that are changing slowly with the kind of the environmental movement, at least the proper grassroots environmental movement, the good organizations teaming up with people's movements as well. So there, I think we also need to examine what is the corporate environmental lobby as well. You can't take money from Jeff Bezos, which by the way the biggest environmental grant that was just handed out. How many $1 million is that? It's insane. Which are the 5 organizations that have got it? You know, not the Global Environment Festival. This is Jeff Bezos just giving it to the NGOs that he wanted to give it to. WWF, the Nature Conservancy, Conservation International, and 2 other countries.
Gulf of Mannar also Jeff is there, na? Gulf of Mannar, Jeff is there, Sundarbans also.
No, Jeff is a UN body. Jeff is called the Global Environmental Facility, which is a funding mechanism. Governments put money into it, and the United Nations Environment Program, CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, they come up with projects which are done in partnership with either civil society or mainly with governments. Some of them are bad projects, some are also doing good work because luckily they have some. But if you see some of these private investments in environment, they might be doing, I'm not saying everything WWF does is bad, they do lots of good work as well. But this is what some of the compromises that are going to be made or continue to be made in the environmental movement as well. Which I'm not saying anyone is kind of, holier than thou in that way. A lot of us are doing this.
So they have to understand that the environmental movement strictly many times have talked about only protecting environment, not looking at the livelihood issues of the communities. Whether it is forest, whether it is fisheries, whether it is agriculture. So they have divided themselves, they have separated themselves. But there are negotiations and discussions within environmental movement also. You have to consider livelihood cannot be separated from, you have to have a broader outlook of linking livelihood issues also looking livelihood. That's one thing. Conservation is purely they look at conservation. Like WWF and a few more top international NGOs. They want all conservations. They negotiate with the international organizations for conservation where they ban fisheries. They don't allow fishing communities to fish in those zones, but they allow oil drilling. They allow all other industries. What does it mean for conservation? So conservation movements are WWF and all other movements are not questioning that part of it, but they question the part of the livelihood dependent, resource dependent communities who fish there. That's a whole conflict and contradiction within those things.